The crack of a pistol firing into the air shattered the early morning quiet of Rawhide, Nevada, causing Charlotte Wilson to jolt upright in bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her bedroom door flew open seconds later, and her brother Frank stood in the doorway, his face a mask of fury and desperation. "Get up and pack your things," he snarled, his bloodshot eyes revealing a night spent drinking. "Only what you can carry on horseback." "Frank, what's happened?" Charlotte asked, clutching her quilt to her chest, a chill running through her that had nothing to do with the cool May morning of 1878. "Just do as I say," he shouted, slamming the door behind him. Charlotte's trembling hands fumbled with her clothing as she dressed quickly, her mind racing. At 22, she had been managing their modest ranch house since their parents died 4 years ago, while Frank, 8 years her senior, handled the cattle operation. But lately, his gambling and drinking had grown worse, and she'd noticed more cattle missing from their herd each month. She grabbed her mother's silver hairbrush, a small leather-bound journal, and a photograph of her parents, stuffing them into a canvas bag along with 2 dresses and necessary undergarments. As she worked, she could hear Frank's heavy footsteps pacing the wooden floor of their small ranch house, punctuated by the occasional crash of something being thrown. When Charlotte emerged from her room, her brother was waiting, a rope in his hands. "Frank?" she questioned, backing away instinctively. "What are you doing?" "The cattle are gone, Charlotte," he said, his voice hollow. "Every last one. I lost them all." "What do you mean, lost them?" she asked, though the sinking feeling in her stomach told her she already knew. "Gambling debt," he admitted, looking anywhere but at her face. "I owed money to Dawson. A lot of money." Charlotte felt the blood drain from her face. Silas Dawson was the most ruthless cattle baron in the territory, a man who collected debts one way or another. "So we'll sell the ranch," Charlotte suggested desperately. "Start over somewhere else." Frank laughed bitterly. "Ranch belongs to Dawson now too. Everything does." "Everything except me," Charlotte said firmly, lifting her chin. "I'll find work in town. Maybe Mrs. Peterson needs help at the boarding house." "It's too late for that," Frank interrupted, finally meeting her eyes, his own filled with a terrible resolve that made her blood run cold. "Dawson's men are coming at noon. I made a deal." Understanding dawned slowly, horror creeping over Charlotte like ice water. "What kind of deal, Frank?" "You," he said simply. "You're the payment." Charlotte's bag slipped from nerveless fingers, hitting the floor with a soft thud. "You can't be serious. You're selling me. Your own sister." "Not selling," Frank corrected as if the distinction mattered. "Offering you in marriage to settle the debt. Dawson has a son about your age. Been looking for a wife." "Noah Dawson is a monster just like his father," Charlotte cried, backing toward the door. "I'd rather die than marry him." Frank lunged forward, grabbing her arm with bruising force. "You think I want this? You think I have a choice? They'll kill us both if I don't pay what I owe." Charlotte twisted, trying to break free, but her brother was stronger. In one swift motion, he looped the rope around her wrists, binding them tightly. "I'm sorry, Charlotte," he said, and for a moment she could see genuine regret in his eyes. "But it's done." Hours later, Charlotte sat rigidly on a kitchen chair, her wrists raw from struggling against her bonds. She had screamed herself hoarse, begging Frank to reconsider, to run away with her, to find another solution. But he had simply walked outside to the barn, returning with a bottle of whiskey that he was now steadily draining as they waited. The sound of approaching horses made them both freeze. Frank stumbled to his feet, grabbing his rifle from above the mantel before moving to the window. "It's not Dawson," he said, frowning. "Just one rider." Charlotte's heart leaped with hope. Perhaps it was the sheriff or one of their neighbors, someone who could help her. The door opened without a knock, and a tall man stepped inside, ducking slightly to clear the doorframe. Dust covered his dark clothes and the brim of his black hat shadowed his face. When he straightened, Charlotte caught a glimpse of piercing blue eyes in a sun-weathered face. "Who the hell are you?" Frank demanded, raising his rifle. The stranger ignored the weapon, his gaze traveling from Frank to Charlotte, lingering on her bound wrists before returning to her brother. "Name's Thomas Drake," he said, his voice low and even. "Heard you're in trouble with Dawson." Frank's finger twitched on the trigger. "That's not your concern, mister." "Might be," Drake replied, removing his hat and revealing thick brown hair streaked with gold from the sun. He was younger than Charlotte had first thought, perhaps in his late 20s. "I'm looking to buy cattle." "Heard you might be selling." A bitter laugh escaped Frank's lips. "You're too late. Cattle are gone." "All of them?" Drake asked, his expression remaining neutral. "Every last one," Frank confirmed, taking another swig from his bottle. Drake nodded slowly, his gaze drifting back to Charlotte. "And the lady? Is she part of Dawson's payment?" Charlotte felt heat rise to her cheeks, both from shame and anger at being discussed like property. "My sister," Frank said shortly. "And yes." "Please," Charlotte said, finding her voice at last. "Help me. My brother's lost his mind." Drake considered her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch that clinked heavily as he set it on the table. "How much do you owe Dawson?" he asked Frank. Frank lowered the rifle slightly. $2,000. Drake nodded, reaching into another pocket and adding a second pouch beside the first. "I'll give you 6,000 for your sister." Charlotte gasped, outrage flooding through her. This wasn't rescue, this was another man trying to buy her. "You can't be serious," she spat. "I'm not livestock to be traded." But Frank was already stepping forward, his eyes fixed on the money. 6,000. "Frank, no," Charlotte cried, struggling against her bonds. "You can't do this." Drake held up a hand. "I think the lady misunderstands my intentions." His blue eyes met Charlotte's directly. "Miss Wilson, I'm offering to pay off your brother's debt and provide him enough to start over somewhere else. In exchange, I'll take you to safety, away from Dawson and his son." "Why would you do that?" Charlotte asked suspiciously. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing," Drake replied. "Consider it a loan if your pride demands. You can repay me when you're settled and working." Frank shook his head. "Dawson's men will be here any minute. If they find out I've cheated them, then we'd better move quickly," Drake interrupted. "Do we have a deal?" Frank looked at the money, then at Charlotte, indecision warring on his face. "Frank, please," Charlotte pleaded. "If you ever loved me at all, don't send me to Noah Dawson." Something in her brother's eyes shifted, a flash of the boy she'd once known, the brother who had taught her to ride and defended her from schoolyard bullies. He reached forward suddenly and untied her wrists. "Take the money," he told Drake, his voice rough, "and take her far away from here. Dawson will kill me when he finds out, but at least she'll be safe." Drake nodded, crossing to Charlotte and offering his hand. "We need to leave now, Miss Wilson." "Can you ride?" "Since I was 5, Charlotte replied, still uncertain but seeing no better options. Drake helped her to her feet, his touch gentle but firm. "Get your things. We ride hard and don't stop until nightfall." Outside, Charlotte saw Drake's horse, a magnificent black stallion, and beside it, her own mare that Frank must have saddled while she was tied up. Her canvas bag was already secured to the saddle. "Frank," she said, turning back to her brother one last time. He stepped forward awkwardly, then pulled her into a rough embrace. "I'm sorry, Char, for everything. I never meant," his voice broke. "Be safe." Before she could respond, the sound of approaching riders echoed from down the road. Drake was instantly alert, helping Charlotte mount her mare. "That'll be Dawson," Frank said grimly. "Go, I'll stall them." Drake swung onto his stallion with fluid grace. "Head east," he instructed Charlotte. "Stay in the tree line and don't stop for anything." Charlotte hesitated, looking back at the only home she'd ever known, at her brother standing on the porch with his rifle. "Miss Wilson," Drake said urgently, "we need to move now." Taking a deep breath, Charlotte turned her mare and urged her into a gallop, following Drake as he led them away from the ranch and toward the distant mountains. Behind them, she heard shouts and then, terrifyingly, gunshots. She didn't look back. They rode hard for hours, the landscape changing from the familiar ranch lands around Rawhide to rocky foothills and eventually into denser pine forests as they climbed in elevation. Drake set a punishing pace, frequently looking back to ensure they weren't being followed. He barely spoke, only occasionally calling out warnings about difficult terrain ahead. By late afternoon, Charlotte's entire body ached, her hands blistered from gripping the reins so tightly. She had left without proper riding attire, and her everyday dress was hiked indecently high to accommodate straddling the saddle. But far worse than the physical discomfort was the turmoil in her mind. Her brother had tried to sell her to settle a gambling debt. A stranger had paid triple that amount for her. And now she was fleeing into the wilderness with a man she knew nothing about, with only his word that he meant her no harm. When Drake finally signaled for them to stop beside a small stream, Charlotte nearly fell from her mare in exhaustion. "Easy," Drake said at her side instantly, his strong hands helping her down. "You did well. Not many women could keep that pace." Charlotte pulled away from him as soon as her feet touched the ground. "What happens now, Mr. Drake? Where are you taking me?" Drake led both horses to the stream, allowing them to drink. "There's a small town about 30 miles further east called Pinecrest. We'll rest there, get supplies, then continue on to Colorado territory if that suits you." "And if it doesn't?" Charlotte challenged, massaging her sore legs. Drake turned to face her, his expression serious. "Miss Wilson, I understand your suspicion. In your place, I'd feel the same, but I give you my word that you're free to go wherever you wish once we reach Pinecrest. My only concern is getting you beyond Dawson's reach." Charlotte studied him, trying to discern the truth in his steady gaze. "Why did you help me?" "The truth, Mr. Drake." He hesitated, then sighed, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair. "I've had dealings with Silas Dawson before, seen what happens to people who cross him." His jaw tightened. "And I've heard stories about his son Noah that would make your blood run cold." "So it was charity," Charlotte pressed, not quite believing him. Drake shook his head. "Call it settling a debt, though not one you owe." He didn't elaborate further, instead turning back to the horses. "We should rest here for an hour, then push on until dark." "Can you manage that?" Charlotte nodded, not entirely satisfied with his explanation but too tired to press further. She settled on a fallen log, watching as Drake efficiently set up a small camp, offering her jerky and hardtack from his saddlebags. They ate in silence, the only sounds the soft murmuring of the stream and the occasional stamping of the horses. As the shadows lengthened, Drake stood abruptly, his head tilted as if listening. Charlotte froze, suddenly aware of how quiet the forest had become. "Get to the horses," Drake said softly, his hand moving to the revolver at his hip. "Now." Charlotte didn't hesitate, hurrying to where the animals were tethered. As she reached for her mare's reins, a shot rang out, splintering the tree trunk inches from her head. Drake fired back, his movements swift and precise as he positioned himself between Charlotte and the unseen attackers. "Mount up," he shouted, continuing to fire into the trees. Charlotte swung onto her mare, heart pounding. Drake backed toward his stallion, still facing the direction of the attack. "Go," he yelled, finally turning to mount his own horse. "Stay on the trail." They galloped away from the stream, bullets whizzing past them. Charlotte bent low over her mare's neck, terror giving her a fresh surge of energy. Drake rode close beside her, occasionally turning in his saddle to fire back at their pursuers. The forest grew denser, the trail narrower, branches whipping at Charlotte's face as they raced through the gathering dusk. She could hear hoofbeats behind them, drawing closer. Suddenly, Drake veered off the main trail, leading them down a steep embankment toward a ravine below. Charlotte followed, trusting his judgment more than her own in that moment. Their horses slid and scrambled down the slope, sending rocks and dirt cascading around them. At the bottom, Drake guided them into the shallow water of a creek bed, then upstream. "The water will hide our tracks," he explained breathlessly, "and the ravine walls will make it harder for them to spot us." They pushed on through the twilight, the creek eventually widening into a small river. The sounds of pursuit faded, but Drake maintained their pace, only slowing when true darkness made it dangerous to continue at speed. "We'll need to make camp," Drake finally said, his voice tight with exhaustion. "Find a defensible position." They found a small clearing ringed by large boulders, offering some protection from both the elements and potential attackers. Drake worked quickly, unsaddling the horses and setting up a rudimentary camp, though he forbade lighting a fire. "Who were they?" Charlotte asked, huddled against a boulder and shivering in the cool night air. "Dawson's men," Drake replied grimly. "Your brother must not have been able to hold them off for long." The mention of Frank sent a stab of fear through Charlotte. "Do you think he's—" "I don't know," Drake said honestly. "Frank Wilson struck me as a survivor." Charlotte wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly overcome by the events of the day. Her entire life had been uprooted in the space of hours. Her home was gone, her brother possibly dead, and she was fleeing with a stranger into unknown territory. A sob escaped her before she could stop it, then another, until she was crying in earnest, her shoulders shaking with the force of her grief. Drake hesitated, then moved to sit beside her, awkwardly offering his coat. "Here," he said, draping it around her shoulders. "It'll be warmer." The unexpected kindness only made Charlotte cry harder. Drake sat silently beside her, not touching her but remaining close, a steady presence until her tears finally subsided. "I'm sorry," she said, wiping at her face with her sleeve. "It's just been a bit much to take in." "No need to apologize," Drake replied. "You've handled yourself better than most men would have in your situation." Charlotte managed a watery smile. High praise from a man who apparently makes a habit of rescuing women from cattle barons. A corner of Drake's mouth lifted in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "First time, actually. Usually I just deliver cattle." "Is that what you do? You're a cattle driver," Drake nodded. "Among other things. I was heading to Rawhide on business when I heard talk in a saloon about Dawson calling in a debt from the Wilson Ranch. When they mentioned the sister being part of the payment, he shrugged. Seemed like something I should look into." Charlotte studied him in the dim moonlight. "You risked your life for a stranger." "Wouldn't be the first time," he said quietly, something haunted passing briefly across his features. "Get some sleep, Miss Wilson. I'll keep watch." Charlotte wanted to ask more questions, but exhaustion was overtaking her. She leaned back against the boulder, Drake's coat a comforting weight around her shoulders, and closed her eyes. Dawn came too quickly, pale light filtering through the trees and rousing Charlotte from fitful sleep. She sat up, momentarily disoriented until the events of the previous day rushed back. Drake was already awake, or perhaps had never slept tending to the horses. "Morning," he said, noticing her stirring. "How are you feeling?" Charlotte stretched, wincing at the stiffness in her muscles from the hard riding. "Like I've been trampled by a herd of cattle." Drake nodded sympathetically. "First day's always the worst. It'll ease up." He offered her a canteen and some more jerky. Not much of a breakfast, I'm afraid. It's fine, Charlotte assured him, suddenly ravenous despite the tough, salty meat. How far to Pinecrest? We should reach it by midday if we keep a good pace, Drake replied, studying the sky. Weather's holding at least. They broke camp quickly, Drake insisting on checking for signs of pursuit before they set out. He seemed satisfied that they had lost their trackers during the night, but his vigilance didn't waver as they resumed their journey. The terrain grew increasingly mountainous, the air cooler and crisper as they climbed. Charlotte found herself marveling at the beauty of the landscape, despite their circumstances, sweeping vistas of pine forests, dramatic rock formations, and distant snow-capped peaks. It's beautiful, she said during a brief stop to rest the horses. I've never been this far from Rawhide before, Drake nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon. Nevada has its charms, but wait until you see Colorado, some of the prettiest country God ever made. You've traveled a lot then? Charlotte asked, curious about this reserved man who had turned her life upside down. Enough, he replied cryptically, then softened slightly at her obvious disappointment with the answer. I was born in Missouri. Left home at 16, worked cattle drives in Texas, scouted for the Army for a while. Spent the last few years moving between Nevada and Colorado territories. No family, Charlotte ventured. Something shuddered in Drake's expression. Not anymore. Before she could ask more, he straightened, pointing ahead. Look there. In the distance, Charlotte could make out thin wisps of smoke rising above the trees. Pinecrest, Drake nodded. We'll be there in a couple of hours. He hesitated, then added, once we're there, you'll need to decide what you want to do next. I can help you get set up somewhere safe, or if you have family elsewhere, I can see about getting you passage. The reality of her situation hit Charlotte anew. She had no home to return to, no family besides Frank, whose fate remained unknown. She had some education enough to perhaps work as a teacher or shopkeeper's assistant, but little practical experience beyond running a ranch household. I don't know, she admitted. I haven't had time to think that far ahead. Drake swung back onto his stallion. No rush to decide. First, let's get you to town and find a proper meal and bath. The promise of both was enough to motivate Charlotte through the final leg of their journey. By early afternoon, they were riding into the small settlement of Pinecrest, a logging town nestled in a valley between towering mountains. Despite its remote location, the town was bustling with activity. Lumber mills operated at the edge of town, their saws whining in the distance. The main street featured the usual establishment's general store, saloon, blacksmith, as well as a modest hotel with a sign advertising hot baths, 25 cents. Drake led them directly to the hotel, dismounting and helping Charlotte down from her mare. She was painfully aware of her disheveled appearance, her dress dirty and creased, her hair a tangled mess after 2 days on the trail. Wait here, Drake said, tethering their horses to the hitching post. I'll see about rooms. He disappeared inside, leaving Charlotte to stand awkwardly on the boardwalk, conscious of curious glances from passers-by. A young woman alone, travel-worn and arriving with a solitary male companion, was bound to raise eyebrows even in a frontier town. Drake emerged a few minutes later, a key in his hand. I've got you a room, he said, and arranged for bath water to be sent up. The owner's wife may have some clothing to spare until we can visit the general store. Thank you, Charlotte said sincerely, touched by his consideration. What about you? I'll get another room, Drake replied, after I see to the horses and make some inquiries around town. Charlotte frowned. Inquiries? Need to make sure Dawson doesn't have connections here, he explained. Better to know if we need to move on quickly." The practical reminder of their situation sobered Charlotte. She followed Drake into the hotel, where the proprietor's wife, a kindly woman in her 50s named Mrs. Hayward, immediately took Charlotte under her wing. "You poor dear," she clucked, leading Charlotte upstairs. "Come along. We'll get you settled. My Emma's about your size. I'm sure some of her things will fit you until you can get proper clothes." Charlotte was shown to a small but clean room with a real bed, a luxury after the previous night on the ground. True to Drake's word, two young men soon arrived carrying a copper tub, followed by others with buckets of steaming water. Once alone, Charlotte stripped off her filthy clothes and sank into the bath with a sigh of pure bliss. As she scrubbed away the dirt of the trail, she found herself thinking about Thomas Drake. He remained something of an enigma, clearly dangerous when necessary, yet unfailingly courteous to her. His determination to see her safely away from Dawson seemed genuine, but she still didn't fully understand his motivations. After her bath, Charlotte dressed in the borrowed clothing, a simple blue cotton dress that was slightly too short but otherwise fit well enough. Mrs. Hayward had also provided a hairbrush, allowing Charlotte to tame her tangled auburn hair into a presentable braid. A soft knock at the door announced the arrival of a tray with a hearty meal of beef stew, fresh bread, and apple pie. Charlotte fell upon the food ravenously, realizing just how inadequate their trail rations had been. She had just finished eating when another knock came. Opening the door cautiously, she found Drake standing in the hallway, freshly bathed himself and wearing clean clothes. Without the trail dust, Charlotte was struck anew by his handsome features, strong jawline, straight nose, and those penetrating blue eyes that seemed to see right through her. "May I come in?" he asked. "I have news." Charlotte hesitated, then nodded, leaving the door open as propriety demanded. Drake stepped inside but remained standing near the entrance. "I've been asking around town," he said without preamble. "No one's seen any of Dawson's men, but there's been talk of hired guns looking for a woman and her kidnapper in towns to the south." Charlotte sank onto the edge of the bed. "So they're still searching for us?" "Yes," Drake confirmed, "but they're looking in the wrong direction, which gives us time. I think we should head for Colorado as planned. I know people there who can help get you situated." "I see," Charlotte said slowly. "And what about you? Will you stay in Colorado as well?" Drake shifted uncomfortably. "I have business to attend to elsewhere once I know you're safe." Of course, Charlotte thought. Once his self-appointed mission was complete, Thomas Drake would move on. The thought brought an unexpected pang of disappointment. "How soon do we leave?" she asked, focusing on practicalities. "Dawn tomorrow, if that suits you," Drake replied. "I've arranged for fresh supplies and proper riding clothes for you. The journey will take about a week if the weather holds." Charlotte nodded, resigned to more hard riding but seeing no better options. "I should thank you properly, Mr. Drake. You've gone to extraordinary expense and trouble for me." Drake waved away her thanks. The money meant nothing. As for the trouble, his expression softened slightly. "Let's just say I sleep better knowing Noah Dawson won't get his hands on you." There was a personal edge to his words that made Charlotte curious. "You mentioned you had dealings with the Dawsons before. What happened?" Drake's face closed off immediately. "It doesn't matter now. Get some rest, Miss Wilson. We have another long day ahead of us tomorrow." He left before she could press further, closing the door firmly behind him. Charlotte stared after him, more intrigued than ever by the mysterious cowboy who had rescued her. Later that evening, after visiting the general store to acquire proper riding attire and a few personal necessities, Charlotte found herself unable to sleep despite the comfortable bed. The events of the past 2 days kept replaying in her mind, along with worries about what lay ahead. On impulse, she threw on her shawl and slipped downstairs, hoping some fresh air might clear her thoughts. The hotel had a small porch at the back, overlooking a creek that ran behind the property. To her surprise, Drake was already there, leaning against the railing and staring out at the water, a cigarette glowing between his fingers. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked without turning, somehow sensing her presence. "Too much on my mind," Charlotte admitted, joining him at the railing but keeping a respectable distance. Drake nodded, taking a last drag of his cigarette before extinguishing it. "Understandable." They stood in silence for a few moments, listening to the gentle burbling of the creek and the distant hooting of an owl. "I keep thinking about Frank," Charlotte finally said, "wondering if he's alive or dead." Drake turned to look at her, his expression somber in the moonlight. "Would you like me to find out?" Charlotte blinked in surprise. "How?" "I could send a telegram to a contact in Virginia City," Drake explained. "Ask him to make discreet inquiries." "You would do that?" Charlotte asked, touched by the offer. Drake shrugged. "He's your brother. Despite what he did, you have a right to know his fate." Charlotte studied the strong profile of the man beside her. "You're not what I expected, Mr. Drake." A faint smile crossed his lips. "And what did you expect?" "I'm not sure," she admitted. "But most men who pay $6,000 for a woman want something in return." Drake's smile faded. "I told you before I don't want anything from you." "Yes, but why?" Charlotte pressed, emboldened by the intimate darkness. "There must be a reason you were so determined to keep me from the Dawsons." Drake was quiet for so long that Charlotte thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low she had to lean closer to hear. 3 years ago, Silas Dawson wanted land that belonged to a rancher named James Blackwood. When Blackwood refused to sell, Dawson had his men burn him out. Drake's hands tightened on the railing. Blackwood's wife died in the fire. Their daughter Rebecca was taken by Noah Dawson. Charlotte's breath caught. "What happened to her?" "She killed herself 2 months later," Drake said flatly. "She was 19 years old." "That's horrible," Charlotte whispered, understanding dawning. "Were you close to her?" Drake shook his head. "I didn't know her. But I knew Blackwood. He gave me my first job when I came west. He was a good man." He turned to face Charlotte directly. "When I heard about your situation, it felt like a chance to, I don't know, make something right that I couldn't fix before." The raw honesty in his voice touched something deep inside Charlotte. On impulse, she reached out and placed her hand over his on the railing. "Thank you for telling me, and for what you did." Drake looked down at her hand, then back at her face, something shifting in his expression. For a breathless moment, Charlotte thought he might move closer, but instead he gently withdrew his hand. "Dawn comes early," he said, his voice slightly rough. "You should get some sleep." Charlotte nodded, suddenly aware of the impropriety of their situation alone together in the darkness, sharing confidences. "Good night, Mr. Drake." As she turned to go, his voice stopped her. "Thomas," he said. "My friends call me Thomas or Tom." Charlotte smiled over her shoulder. "Good night, Thomas. I'm Charlotte to my friends." She could feel his eyes on her as she walked back inside, her heart beating a little faster than before. Morning brought clear skies and a brisk wind from the mountains, good traveling weather, according to Drake. They set out from Pinecrest just after sunrise, their horses rested, and their saddlebags filled with fresh supplies. Charlotte felt like a different woman from the one who had fled her brother's ranch. Her new riding clothes, sturdy trousers worn beneath a split skirt, a warm jacket, and proper boots were far more practical than her previous attire. Mrs. Hayward had helped her plait her hair into a single thick braid that would stay neat during the journey, and the general store had provided a wide-brimmed hat to protect her face from the sun. Drake had been all business that morning, focusing on their preparations and discussing their route east through the mountains. If he was thinking about their conversation from the night before, he gave no sign of it. "We'll follow the old mining trail through Copper Pass," he explained as they rode. "It's steeper, but less traveled. Should help us avoid any unwanted attention." Charlotte nodded, getting the sense that he was deliberately maintaining a professional distance between them. She told herself it was for the best. She was dependent on him for her safety, and complications would only make their situation more difficult. They rode steadily through the day, the terrain growing more challenging as they climbed. Drake was an excellent guide, pointing out landmarks and teaching Charlotte trail signs as they traveled. By midday, they had reached a high ridge that offered a spectacular view of the valley they had left behind. "It's magnificent," Charlotte said, reining her mare to a stop beside Drake's stallion. "I never imagined such vastness." Drake nodded, a rare smile softening his features. "That's why I keep moving, I suppose. Always another vista just over the next ridge." Charlotte studied him curiously. "You don't ever want to settle down, have a home of your own?" Something wistful crossed Drake's face. "Used to dream of it. A ranch in good cattle country, maybe up in Colorado or Montana, somewhere with mountains nearby and plenty of water." "What stopped you?" Charlotte asked. Drake shrugged, his expression closing again. "Life had other plans. We should keep moving. There's a good camping spot about 2 hours ahead." The weather held through the afternoon, but as evening approached, dark clouds began gathering over the higher peaks. Drake frowned at the sky, pushing them to reach a sheltered grove of pines before the storm hit. They barely made it in time. The first heavy drops were falling as they unsaddled the horses and set up camp beneath the dense evergreens. Drake worked quickly, constructing a lean-to from pine boughs that would offer additional protection from the rain. "It might be a rough night," he warned, securing their supplies under the makeshift shelter. "Mountain storms can be fierce." As if to punctuate his words, lightning split the sky, followed by a crash of thunder that made the horses stamp nervously. The rain intensified, drumming against the pine needles above them. Drake managed to get a small fire started in the shelter of a rock outcropping, providing enough heat to cook a simple meal of beans and salt pork. They ate huddled close to the flames, the temperature dropping rapidly as night fell. "Will the horses be all right?" Charlotte asked, watching as rain streamed down around their little island of relative dryness. "They'll be fine," Drake assured her. "I've hobbled them under those thick pines. They're hardy animals." Another flash of lightning illuminated the campsite, followed almost immediately by a deafening thunderclap. Charlotte jumped despite herself. "Not fond of storms?" Drake asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. "Not particularly," Charlotte admitted. "Especially not when I'm sitting on a mountain in the wilderness," Drake chuckled. "Fair enough. But we're safer here than we would be in the open." The storm intensified through the evening, the wind whipping through the trees and occasionally sending sprays of water into their shelter. Charlotte found herself edging closer to Drake and the fire, both for warmth and security. "Try to get some sleep," Drake suggested, adding more wood to the fire. "I'll keep watch and make sure the fire doesn't go out." Charlotte nodded, wrapping herself in her bedroll and lying down as close to the fire as was safe. Despite her exhaustion, sleep proved elusive, each crash of thunder jolting her back to full alertness. After an hour of tossing restlessly, she gave up and sat up. Drake was still awake, his back against a tree trunk, watching the storm through the gaps in their shelter. "Can't sleep?" he asked quietly. Charlotte shook her head. "Too loud, and I keep thinking about—" She hesitated, then continued, "about Frank and Dawson's men and everything that's happened." Drake studied her thoughtfully, then reached for his saddlebag. To Charlotte's surprise, he pulled out a small leather-bound book. "What's that?" she asked. "Poetry," he replied, a little self-consciously. "Whitman helps pass the time on long trails." Charlotte blinked in surprise. "You read poetry?" A faint smile touched Drake's lips. "Don't look so shocked. Even cowboys appreciate fine words now and then." "Would you?" Charlotte hesitated, then asked, "Would you read some? It might help drown out the storm." Drake seemed taken aback by the request, but after a moment's consideration he nodded. Opening the book to a dog-eared page, he began to read, his deep voice adding resonance to Whitman's words about the open road and the journey of life. Charlotte closed her eyes, letting the poetry wash over her, Drake's steady voice creating a counterpoint to the wild storm outside. Gradually, the tension eased from her body, and before he had finished the third poem, she had drifted into sleep. She woke to silence and the pale light of dawn filtering through the pine boughs. The storm had passed, leaving the forest fresh and dripping. Drake was already up, tending to the horses and preparing a simple breakfast of coffee and hardtack. "Good morning," he said when he noticed her stirring. "Sleep well," Charlotte nodded, a little embarrassed to realize she must have fallen asleep during his reading. "Yes, thank you." "And thank you for the poetry. It helped." Drake shrugged, but she caught a pleased expression briefly crossing his face. "Storms passed. Should be good traveling today, though the trails might be muddy." They broke camp efficiently, falling into an easy rhythm that suggested they'd been traveling together far longer than just a few days. As they rode, Charlotte found herself studying Drake when he wasn't looking the confident set of his shoulders, the gentle way he handled his horse, the occasional smile that transformed his serious face. It was dangerous, she knew, to develop feelings for the man who had rescued her. Once they reached Colorado, he would deliver her to safety and continue on his way. But knowledge of the danger didn't stop the warmth that spread through her chest when he turned to make sure she was keeping up, or the flutter in her stomach when their hands accidentally brushed as they shared supplies. The days blended together as they traveled eastward, crossing from Nevada territory into Utah, and then approaching the Colorado border. They settled into a comfortable routine, riding from dawn until late afternoon, making camp, sharing simple meals and increasingly less simple conversations. Drake gradually revealed more of himself, his childhood in Missouri, as the son of a horse trainer, his early years working cattle drives in Texas, his time scouting for the Army during the final years of the Indian Wars. He spoke of places he'd seen and people he'd met, though he remained reticent about certain periods of his life. In turn, Charlotte shared stories of growing up on the ranch outside Rawhide, of her parents and the dreams she'd had before their deaths had left her responsible for maintaining the household, while Frank ran the cattle operation. "I wanted to be a teacher," she admitted one evening as they sat beside a campfire. "I even took some courses by mail from a college back east, but after Mother and Father died, there wasn't time or money for such things." "It's not too late," Drake pointed out. "You're young yet." Charlotte smiled wistfully. "Perhaps, but circumstances have a way of narrowing one's options." Drake studied her across the flames. "Is that what you want to do in Colorado? Teach?" The question made Charlotte realize she hadn't given much thought to her future beyond reaching safety. "I don't know," she admitted. "What's it like, the place we're heading, Silver Creek?" "It's a decent-sized town," Drake replied. "Started as a mining settlement but grew into something more stable. Has a school, several churches, proper businesses. The people I know there, the Hendersons, own the largest general store. Good folks. They've been looking for help, and they have rooms above the store where you could stay." Charlotte nodded slowly, trying to picture herself in this unknown town, working in a store starting over. And you? Will you stay there too? Drake's gaze dropped to the fire. For a little while, maybe. I have business in Denver eventually. He hesitated, then added, but I won't leave until I'm sure you're settled and safe. The statement should have reassured her, but instead, it served as a reminder that their time together had a definite end point. Charlotte was surprised by how much the thought troubled her. On the 7th day of their journey, they crossed into Colorado territory, the landscape changing subtly as they descended from the higher mountains into a broad, fertile valley cradled between two mountain ranges. There, Drake said late in the afternoon, pointing to a cluster of buildings nestled beside a winding creek. Silver Creek. Charlotte reined her mare to a stop beside him, taking in the sight of the town that might become her new home. It was larger than Rawhide, with several streets of buildings and what appeared to be a small commercial district at its center. The setting sun glinted off church spires and metal rooftops, giving the town a golden glow. "It's lovely," she said softly. Drake nodded. "It's a good place. Growing but not too fast, still has a sense of community." He glanced at her. "You could build a life here if you wanted to." Something in his tone made Charlotte look at him sharply, but his expression revealed nothing. "I suppose we'll see," she said carefully. They rode into town just as dusk was falling, the main street still busy with evening activity. Charlotte was conscious of curious glances as they passed a dusty man and woman who had obviously been on the trail for days, were bound to attract attention in a settled community. Drake led them to a 2-story building with Henderson's General Mercantile painted on a large sign across the front. Light spilled from its windows, and several customers were just leaving as they approached. "Wait here," Drake said, dismounting and tying his horse to the hitching post. "Let me speak to Robert first." Charlotte nodded, suddenly nervous about meeting these friends of Drake's who might become her employers and landlords. She watched as Drake entered the store, disappearing from view. Several minutes passed before the door opened again. Drake emerged accompanied by a tall, broad-shouldered man with graying brown hair and a neatly trimmed beard. The man, presumably Robert Henderson, hurried toward Charlotte with a warm smile. "Miss Wilson," he said, reaching up to help her down from her horse. "Thomas has told us about your situation. Please, come inside where it's warm. My wife is eager to meet you." Charlotte allowed herself to be assisted down, legs stiff from the day's riding. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson. It's kind of you to welcome me so late in the day." "Nonsense," Henderson replied jovially. "Any friend of Thomas Drake is welcome in our home anytime." He turned to Drake. "Why don't you take the horses around back to the stable? James can help you get them settled while I introduce Miss Wilson to Margaret." Drake nodded, gathering the reins of both horses. "I'll join you shortly," he told Charlotte, leading the animals away. Inside, Henderson's General Mercantile proved to be a well-stocked, orderly establishment that seemed to carry everything from farming implements to fancy dress goods. At the back, a door led to what appeared to be living quarters. Robert Henderson ushered Charlotte through this door into a cozy parlor where a plump, pleasant-faced woman was setting out tea things. "Margaret," Henderson said, "this is Miss Charlotte Wilson, Thomas's friend from Nevada." Margaret Henderson beamed, immediately coming forward to take Charlotte's hands in her own. "My dear, we're so pleased to meet you. Thomas sent a telegram last week saying he was bringing a young lady who needed a fresh start. We've prepared the guest room for you. You must be exhausted after your journey." Charlotte blinked in surprise. "A telegram, but we've been on the trail for days. He must have sent it from Pinecrest before you left," Robert explained. "Thomas always thinks ahead." The thought that Drake had been planning for her arrival even before they left Nevada touched Charlotte deeply. He hadn't just rescued her on impulse, he had been ensuring her future security from the very beginning. Margaret bustled about, pouring tea and offering Charlotte a plate of fresh biscuits that made her mouth water after days of trail rations. "Robert tells me you might be interested in working in the store," she said. "We could certainly use the help, especially someone with education." "Thomas mentioned you had hoped to be a teacher," Robert added. "As it happens, our town is growing rapidly, and the school board has been discussing the need for an assistant to Mr. Parker, our current schoolmaster." Charlotte set her teacup down in surprise. "Are you suggesting I might teach here?" "Not immediately, perhaps," Robert said. "But after you've settled in and the town has gotten to know you, it would be a possibility worth exploring. In the meantime, we genuinely need help in the store, particularly with the bookkeeping." Charlotte felt a surge of hope for the first time in days. These kind people were offering not just immediate safety but a future with real possibilities. "I don't know what to say except thank you." The back door opened, and Drake stepped into the parlor, his hat in his hands. He had clearly taken a moment to wash up, his face and hair damp, though his clothing was still trail dusty. "Thomas," Margaret said warmly, "come have some tea. I was just telling Miss Wilson about the possibility of her eventually teaching at the school." Drake glanced at Charlotte, a smile tugging at his lips when he saw her obvious excitement. "That would suit you," he said simply. The four of them talked late into the evening, the Hendersons filling them in on town news and asking discreet questions about their journey. Charlotte noticed that Drake carefully edited their story, mentioning only that she had needed to leave Nevada urgently due to family difficulties, and that he had offered escort to Colorado where she could make a fresh start. Eventually, Margaret noticed Charlotte trying to stifle a yawn. "Where are my manners?" she exclaimed. "You poor dears must be exhausted. Let me show you to your rooms." She led them upstairs to a hallway with several doors. "Miss Wilson, this will be your room," she said, opening one to reveal a pretty bedroom with flowered wallpaper and a real bed that looked heavenly to Charlotte's trail-weary eyes. "And Thomas, you'll be in the room at the end of the hall as usual." As usual. The casual phrase suggested Drake had stayed with the Hendersons many times before. Charlotte felt a stab of curiosity about this man who seemed to have connections and friends across multiple territories, but no permanent home of his own. "Thank you, Margaret," Drake said, "for everything." When the older woman had gone, Drake lingered in the hallway with Charlotte. "Will you be comfortable here?" he asked quietly. Charlotte nodded. "The Hendersons are lovely. I can't believe you arranged all this in advance." Drake shrugged. It seemed prudent. He hesitated, then added, "I'll be staying for a few days to make sure you're settled. After that, you'll go to Denver," Charlotte finished for him, trying to keep disappointment from her voice. Drake studied her face for a long moment, something unreadable in his eyes. "Yes," he finally said. "I have business there that can't wait much longer." Charlotte nodded, forcing a smile. "Well, I'm grateful for everything you've done. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "There's nothing to repay," Drake said firmly. "Just—" he seemed to struggle for words. "Just be happy here, Charlotte." "That's enough." Before she could respond, he turned and walked to his room, closing the door behind him. Charlotte stood in the hallway for a moment longer, a confusing mixture of gratitude, sadness, and something deeper swirling within her. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Margaret Henderson took Charlotte under her wing, introducing her to the workings of the store and to various townspeople who came in to shop. Robert began teaching her the bookkeeping system, pleased to discover she had a quick mind for figures. Drake made himself useful around the Hendersons' property, repairing a leaky roof, chopping firewood, and helping with various tasks that Robert, at 62, found increasingly difficult. But each evening he seemed more distant, spending time alone or in conversation with Robert rather than joining the general socializing. On the fourth day, a telegram arrived for Drake. Charlotte was helping Margaret organize new fabric stock when he came into the store, his expression grave. "What is it?" Charlotte asked, setting aside a bolt of calico. "News from Virginia City," Drake replied, glancing at the yellow paper in his hand. "About your brother." Charlotte's heart skipped a beat. "Is he?" "He's alive," Drake said quickly, "but he's in jail. Apparently, he shot one of Dawson's men during the confrontation after we left. The man survived, so Frank's only facing assault charges, not murder." Relief washed through Charlotte, followed quickly by concern. "Will he stay in jail?" Drake shrugged. "Depends on whether he can make bail, and whether Dawson pursues the matter. My contact says there's talk that Dawson might drop the charges in exchange for the deed to your ranch, which Frank apparently still holds." Charlotte absorbed this information, her feelings toward her brother still complicated. He had tried to sell her to settle a debt, yet he had also fought to give her a chance to escape. "At least he's alive," she said finally. Drake nodded, folding the telegram and tucking it away. "There's something else. I need to leave for Denver tomorrow morning. My business there can't be delayed any longer." Though she had known this was coming, Charlotte felt her heart sink. "I understand," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "When will you return?" Something flickered in Drake's eyes, regret perhaps. "I'm not sure. The business might take me elsewhere afterward." "I see," Charlotte said softly, suddenly finding the fabric in her hands fascinating. "Well, I want to thank you again for everything you've done. I'll never forget it." Drake stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Charlotte, he broke off, seeming to struggle with what he wanted to say. Finally, he simply nodded. "I'm glad you're settling in well here. The Hendersons think highly of you already." That evening, the Hendersons insisted on a special dinner to bid Drake farewell. Margaret prepared a roast with all the trimmings, and Robert opened a bottle of good whiskey. The conversation flowed easily, with stories and laughter, but Charlotte found it difficult to join in, her heart heavy with the knowledge that Drake would be gone in the morning. After dinner, as Margaret and Charlotte cleared the dishes, the older woman gave her a knowing look. "He cares for you, you know," she said quietly. Charlotte nearly dropped the plate she was holding. "I don't know what you mean." Margaret smiled gently. "I've known Thomas Drake for 7 years. He stayed with us many times, always passing through, never lingering. Yet he's been here 4 days with no sign of restlessness until that telegram arrived." She patted Charlotte's hand. "And I've seen the way he looks at you when he thinks no one is watching." Charlotte felt her cheeks warm. "He rescued me because he felt sorry for me, that's all." "Is it?" Margaret asked. "Thomas is a good man, but not a sentimental one. He wouldn't have risked his life for mere charity." She turned back to the dishes. "Just something to consider, my dear." Later that night, unable to sleep, Charlotte slipped downstairs for a glass of water. To her surprise, the back door was open, and through it, she could see Drake sitting on the porch steps, smoking a cigarette. After a moment's hesitation, she stepped outside. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, echoing his question from that night in Pinecrest. Drake glanced up, a faint smile crossing his features. "Too much on my mind." Charlotte sat beside him, careful to maintain a proper distance. "Your business in Denver, partly," he admitted, extinguishing his cigarette. They sat in silence for a few moments, the night air cool but not uncomfortable. Stars blazed overhead, more visible here than they had been in town. "What will you do after Denver?" Charlotte finally asked. Drake shrugged. "Depends on how things go there." "I might head north to Montana for a while." "Always moving," Charlotte observed softly. "It's what I know," Drake replied. Charlotte gathered her courage. "Does it ever get lonely? The constant traveling." Drake was quiet for so long that Charlotte thought he might not answer. "Sometimes," he finally admitted. "More so recently." Their eyes met in the darkness, and Charlotte felt a pull between them that had been growing since that first day on the trail. Drake's gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes. For a moment, Charlotte thought he might close the distance between them. Instead, he stood abruptly. "It's late. We should both get some sleep." Disappointment washed through Charlotte, but she nodded and rose as well. "Safe travels tomorrow, Thomas." Inside, at the foot of the stairs, Drake paused and turned to her. "Charlotte," he said, his voice low and intense. "I want you to know that what I did paying your brother, bringing you here, I don't regret any of it. But I'm not the kind of man who can offer a woman like you what she deserves." "Shouldn't that be my decision?" Charlotte asked quietly. Drake's expression tightened. "You deserve someone stable, someone who can give you a home and security. I live with a saddle for a pillow and no certainty beyond the next job." "You seem very certain about what I deserve," Charlotte said, a hint of irritation entering her voice. "Have you considered asking what I want?" Drake ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of frustration. "Charlotte, you've been through a terrible ordeal. You're grateful, and perhaps that gratitude feels like something more. But in time, don't," Charlotte interrupted, anger flaring. "Don't dismiss my feelings as mere gratitude. I'm not a child, Thomas. I know my own mind." Drake stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. Do you really know what you're asking for? A life of uncertainty, perhaps danger, moving from place to place with a man who has enemies in 3 territories." "I'm asking for nothing," Charlotte replied with dignity. "I'm simply telling you that you don't get to decide what I feel or what I want." She lifted her chin. "Good night, Mr. Drake. I wish you well in Denver." She turned and ascended the stairs without looking back, tears pricking at her eyes. She had been a fool to think that Thomas Drake might harbor feelings for her beyond a sense of obligation. Margaret had been wrong. Whatever she thought she'd seen in his eyes had been nothing more than concern for a woman he had rescued. In her room, Charlotte sat on the edge of her bed, forcing back tears. She would not cry over a man who was leaving anyway. Instead, she would focus on the new life that was opening before her, a position with the Hendersons, the possibility of eventually teaching, a community that seemed welcoming and safe. It was far more than she could have hoped for a week ago, when Frank had tied her wrists and told her she was to be handed over to Noah Dawson. She should be grateful for her escape and the opportunities ahead. And she was grateful. She just hadn't expected that gratitude to be accompanied by the ache of losing something she had never really had. Morning came too soon. Pale light filtering through the curtains as Charlotte dressed for the day. She had barely slept, her mind churning with thoughts of Drake and their conversation on the porch. Part of her wanted to avoid seeing him off, to maintain the dignity of her exit the night before. But a stronger part knew she would regret it if she didn't say a proper goodbye. Downstairs, she found the Hendersons and Drake having breakfast, the atmosphere subdued. Drake was already dressed for travel, his saddlebags packed and waiting by the door. "Good morning, Charlotte," Margaret said, offering a sympathetic smile that suggested she had sensed the tension between Charlotte and Drake. "Come have some breakfast before it gets cold." Charlotte took a seat across from Drake, murmuring a general good morning without meeting his eyes. She could feel his gaze on her, but focused on buttering her toast with great attention. The meal passed with polite conversation about the weather and Drake's route to Denver. When it was finished, Robert rose to help Drake with his gear while Margaret began clearing the table. "I'll help you, Margaret," Charlotte offered quickly, eager to stay busy. "Nonsense," the older woman replied firmly. "Thomas is leaving in a few minutes. Go say your goodbyes while I handle this." Reluctantly, Charlotte followed the men outside to where Drake's stallion was saddled and waiting. Robert was just securing the last of Drake's bags to the saddle. "Well, that should do it," Robert said, stepping back. "Don't be a stranger, Thomas. You know you're always welcome here." "Thank you, Robert," Drake replied, shaking the older man's hand, "for everything." Robert glanced between Drake and Charlotte, then tactfully retreated to the porch where Margaret was waiting, giving them a moment of privacy. Drake turned to Charlotte, his expression guarded. "I want to apologize for last night," he said quietly. "You were right, I shouldn't presume to know what you want or feel." Charlotte nodded, maintaining her composure with effort. "It doesn't matter now. You're leaving and I'm staying. We both have our paths to follow." Drake's jaw tightened. "Charlotte, don't," she interrupted gently. "Let's not part with more words that we might regret. You rescued me, brought me to safety, and gave me a chance at a new life. I'll always be grateful for that." Drake winced at the word grateful but nodded. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small pouch, offering it to her. "This is for you, to help you get established." Charlotte didn't take it. "I've told you before I don't need your money." "It's not charity," Drake insisted. "Consider it an investment in your future teaching career." When Charlotte still hesitated, Drake sighed. "Please. It would ease my mind to know you have something set aside for emergencies." Reluctantly, Charlotte accepted the pouch, surprised by its weight. "Thank you," she said stiffly. Drake studied her face as if committing it to memory, then turned and mounted his horse in one fluid motion. Looking down at her, he said, "Be happy, Charlotte Wilson." Without waiting for a response, he tipped his hat to the Hendersons, then urged his stallion forward, riding out of the yard and down the main street of Silver Creek without looking back. Charlotte watched until he disappeared from view, telling herself that the hollow feeling in her chest would pass with time. This was for the best. Drake had been right about one thing. They were from different worlds, with different needs and expectations. She turned back to the store, where a new day of work awaited her. This was her life now, and she would make the most of it. The weeks following Drake's departure passed quickly, as Charlotte settled into the rhythm of life in Silver Creek. The work at Henderson's General Mercantile proved satisfying, particularly the bookkeeping aspects which utilized her education. She took room and board with the Hendersons, gradually transforming her small bedroom into a space that felt like her own. The townspeople were welcoming, particularly after learning that she had teaching experience. By the end of her first month, Charlotte had been invited to assist with Sunday school and to help Mr. Parker, the aging schoolmaster, 2 afternoons a week. She tried not to think about Thomas Drake, though her mind often wandered to him in quiet moments. There had been no word from him since his departure, which Charlotte told herself was expected. He had fulfilled his obligation to her. There was no reason for further contact. The money he had given her remained untouched in her dresser drawer. When she had finally opened the pouch after his departure, she had been shocked to find it contained nearly $500, a small fortune that could indeed fund a fresh start if she ever needed one. Summer faded into fall, the aspens in the surrounding mountains turning brilliant gold against the dark pines. Charlotte found herself increasingly involved in the community, joining the church choir and attending social gatherings where she met other young people of the town. Among them was Edward Mills, the son of the local banker, who made his interest in Charlotte clear with consistent attention and small gifts. He was handsome in a conventional way, well-educated, and unfailingly polite, exactly the sort of stable, respectable man that Charlotte should be interested in. Yet when Edward invited her to accompany him to the harvest dance, Charlotte found herself hesitating, comparing his proper, predictable manner to Drake's quiet intensity and flashes of dry humor. "You should accept," Margaret advised when Charlotte confided her reluctance. "Edward is a fine young man, and it's been nearly 3 months since you arrived. It's time to embrace your new life fully." Charlotte recognized the wisdom in Margaret's words. Thomas Drake had made his choice when he rode away without looking back. She could not put her life on hold waiting for a man who had made it clear he had no interest in settling down with her or anyone else. So she accepted Edward's invitation, and even allowed Margaret to help her alter one of the older woman's dresses, a lovely burgundy affair with lace trim for the occasion. When Edward arrived to escort her to the town hall where the dance was being held, he complimented her appearance with such genuine appreciation that Charlotte felt a flicker of warmth toward him. The harvest dance was a lively affair, with nearly the entire town in attendance. A local string band played energetic reels and waltzes, and tables along the walls groaned with food contributed by the townswomen. Charlotte found herself genuinely enjoying the evening, dancing not only with Edward but with Robert Henderson and several other men of the community. It was during a brief rest between dances, as she stood chatting with Margaret and several other women, that the doors of the town hall opened and a latecomer stepped inside. Charlotte's heart seemed to stop, then race ahead at double speed. Thomas Drake stood in the doorway, scanning the crowd until his gaze locked with hers across the room. He looked different, cleaner, more polished than she remembered. His usually trailed, dusty clothes had been replaced with a dark suit, his hair neatly trimmed. But the intense blue eyes were the same, now fixed on her with an expression that made her breath catch. "Charlotte." Edward appeared at her elbow, holding 2 glasses of punch. "Are you all right? You look as though you've seen a ghost." Charlotte tore her gaze from Drake to accept the punch with hands that trembled slightly. "I'm fine," she managed, "just a little warm from dancing." Edward followed her earlier line of sight. "I see we have a newcomer. Do you know him?" Before Charlotte could decide how to answer, Margaret stepped in. "That's Thomas Drake, a friend of ours. If you'll excuse me, I should go welcome him." Margaret moved through the crowd toward Drake, who reluctantly shifted his attention from Charlotte to greet the older woman. They conversed briefly, Margaret gesturing animatedly while Drake nodded, his expression serious. "Shall we step outside for some air?" Edward suggested, clearly sensing Charlotte's distraction. Charlotte nodded, allowing him to guide her toward the doors that opened onto a small porch at the rear of the hall. The cool October air was a relief after the warmth inside, and Charlotte took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. "You do know him, don't you?" Edward asked quietly. "The man who just arrived." Charlotte hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, he helped me when I left Nevada, escorted me safely to Silver Creek." Understanding dawned in Edward's eyes. "I see. I had wondered about your arrival here. People said you came with a man who then left town immediately." "It wasn't like that," Charlotte said quickly. "Mr. Drake is a friend of the Hendersons. He was simply doing them a favor by ensuring I arrived safely." Edward studied her face carefully. "Is that all he was doing?" Before Charlotte could respond, the door opened and Drake himself stepped onto the porch. He stopped short at the sight of them, his expression darkening. "Excuse me," he said stiffly. "I didn't mean to interrupt." "Not at all," Edward replied smoothly, extending his hand. "Edward Mills." "And you must be Mr. Drake. I understand you're a friend of the Hendersons." Drake shook Edward's hand briefly. "Yes, and you are." "A friend of Miss Wilson's," Edward said, a subtle emphasis on friend that made Drake's jaw tighten. An awkward silence fell, broken only when the band inside struck up a new tune. "I believe this is our dance, Charlotte," Edward said, offering his arm. "If you're ready to go back inside." Charlotte looked between the two men, torn. Part of her desperately wanted to stay and speak with Drake, to understand why he had returned after 3 months of silence. But another part feared what that conversation might entail, especially with the evidence of her new life in the form of Edward Mills standing right beside her. "Yes, of course," she said finally, taking Edward's arm. To Drake she added, "It's good to see you again, Mr. Drake. I'm sure we'll have a chance to catch up later." Drake nodded, his expression unreadable. "Of course. Enjoy your evening, Miss Wilson." As Edward led her back inside, Charlotte couldn't help looking back over her shoulder. Drake stood at the railing, his tall figure silhouetted against the night sky, watching her go with an intensity that she could feel even at a distance. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur. Charlotte went through the motions of dancing and conversation, but her mind was entirely occupied with questions about Drake's return. Had he merely been passing through? Was there some trouble that had brought him back to Silver Creek? Or had he, perhaps, returned for her? When the dance finally ended and Edward escorted her back to the Hendersons' home, she found herself distracted and poor company. Edward, to his credit, seemed to understand that something had unsettled her and did not press for conversation. At her door, he took her hand gently. "I had a wonderful evening, Charlotte. Thank you for accompanying me." "Thank you for asking me," Charlotte replied, summoning a smile. "It was a lovely dance." Edward hesitated, then said carefully, "I sense that Mr. Drake's arrival has complicated things for you. If you need time to sort through whatever history you share with him, I understand." Charlotte was touched by his perceptiveness and consideration. "You're very kind, Edward. I'm not entirely sure what his return means, if anything." Edward lifted her hand and placed a chaste kiss on her knuckles. "Well, whatever it means, know that my regard for you remains unchanged. Good night, Charlotte." After he left, Charlotte entered the house quietly, not wanting to disturb the Hendersons who had returned earlier. To her surprise, a lamp still burned in the parlor, and as she passed the doorway, she saw Drake seated in Robert's armchair, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He rose when he saw her, setting the glass aside. "Charlotte." She paused in the doorway, suddenly very aware of her party dress and elaborately arranged hair. "Thomas, I didn't realize you were staying here." "Robert insisted," Drake replied, "though I can find a room at the hotel if my presence makes you uncomfortable." "Don't be ridiculous," Charlotte said more sharply than she intended. Taking a breath, she added more calmly, "This is the Hendersons' home. You're their friend. Of course you should stay here." Drake nodded, studying her with an intensity that made her feel exposed. "You look beautiful tonight," he said quietly. "That color suits you." Charlotte felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Thank you, I should be going upstairs, it's late." "Charlotte, wait," Drake said as she turned to go. "I need to speak with you about why I came back." Charlotte's heart beat faster, but she kept her expression neutral. "It can wait until morning, surely. As I said, it's late." Drake looked as though he wanted to argue but nodded reluctantly. "Tomorrow, then." Charlotte escaped to her room, her emotions in turmoil. Seeing Drake again had awakened feelings she had been trying to suppress for months. Yet there was Edward to consider as well, kind, steady Edward who had made his interest in her clear, and who deserved better than to be forgotten the moment Thomas Drake reappeared. Sleep eluded her as she tried to make sense of her conflicted heart. By the time dawn light filtered through her curtains, Charlotte had come to only one conclusion. She needed to hear what Drake had to say before she could decide anything. She dressed simply in a blue cotton dress and pinned her hair in a practical style, then descended to the kitchen where she found Margaret already preparing breakfast. "Good morning, dear," Margaret said, a knowing look in her eyes. "Did you sleep well?" "Not particularly," Charlotte admitted, moving to help with the coffee. "Is he are the men up yet?" "Robert is," Margaret replied. "Thomas went out early, said he had errands to run in town. He asked me to tell you he'd be back by noon and hoped you might walk with him then." Charlotte nodded, both relieved and disappointed by the delay. Of course. The morning passed slowly as Charlotte went through her usual Saturday routine of helping in the store. She found it difficult to concentrate, making small errors in the bookkeeping that she had to go back and correct. Every time the bell over the door jingled, she looked up expectantly. But Drake did not appear. Finally, as the church clock struck noon, the door opened, and Drake stepped inside. He had abandoned the suit from the previous evening in favor of more familiar attire: dark trousers, a blue shirt, and his customary leather vest. His hat was in his hands, suggesting respect for being indoors rather than uncertainty. "Charlotte," he said, nodding to her behind the counter. "Do you have time for that walk now?" Charlotte glanced at Robert, who waved her away with a smile. "Go on, my dear. Saturday afternoons are always quiet. I can manage here." Outside, the October day was crisp but pleasant, the sun warming the boardwalk as they walked side by side toward the edge of town. Neither spoke until they had passed the last buildings and reached a small bridge that crossed Silver Creek, the water running clear and cold over smooth stones. Drake stopped in the middle of the bridge, looking out over the water. "I've been to Denver, Montana, and back to Nevada since I left," he said without preamble. "Took care of the business I needed to handle, made some money, bought some land." Charlotte leaned against the railing beside him. "That sounds productive." Drake glanced at her, a hint of amusement in his eyes at her neutral response. It was, but something was missing. He turned fully to face her, or rather someone. Charlotte's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her expression carefully composed. "Thomas, let me finish," he interrupted gently. "Please. I've rehearsed this speech for about 200 miles, and if I don't get it all out now, I might lose my nerve." Charlotte nodded, folding her hands in front of her to hide their trembling. Drake took a deep breath. "I told myself I left because of business in Denver, and that was partly true, but the real reason was fear." He looked away, his jaw tight. "Fear that I'd get too attached to you. Fear that I'd ruin your chance at a normal life, at the security you deserve. Fear that I wasn't good enough for a woman like you. You never gave me a choice," Charlotte said quietly. "You decided what was best for me without asking what I wanted." "I know," Drake admitted. "It was wrong, and every day since then I've regretted it." He met her gaze directly. "I came back to ask if it's too late, if you could forgive my arrogance and consider giving me a chance to prove I can be worthy of you." Charlotte's breath caught. "And what about your wandering ways? You said yourself you live with a saddle for a pillow." A slow smile spread across Drake's face. "That's part of what I've been doing these past months. I bought land, Charlotte, a ranch about 15 miles northeast of here. Good water, good grazing. I've hired men to start building a proper house. It won't be ready until spring, but—" He hesitated, then continued, "I'm done wandering. I want roots, a home." "With me?" Charlotte asked, scarcely daring to believe what she was hearing. "If you'll have me," Drake replied simply. "I know it's sudden, and I know you have a life here now, friends, perhaps more than friends." His expression darkened slightly. That young man from the dance seemed quite attached. "Edward is a friend," Charlotte said carefully. "A kind man who has shown interest in me, yes, but—" She hesitated, then decided honesty was needed. "But he's not you, Thomas." Hope flared in Drake's eyes. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Charlotte replied, taking a step toward him, "that not a day has passed when I haven't thought of you. When I haven't wondered where you were, what you were doing, if you ever thought of me." "Every day," Drake said hoarsely, closing the remaining distance between them. "Charlotte, Whatever he intended to say was lost as Charlotte rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. Drake froze for a heartbeat, then his arms came around her waist, pulling her closer as he returned the kiss with a fervor that left her breathless. When they finally parted, Charlotte was flushed and Drake's eyes were darker than she had ever seen them. "I love you," he said simply. "I think I have since that first day at your brother's ranch when you stood up to him, despite being terrified." "I love you too," Charlotte replied, the words coming easily now that the barrier between them had finally fallen. "Enough to consider living 15 miles from town on a ranch that doesn't have a house yet." Drake laughed, the sound free and joyous in a way she had never heard from him before. "The house will be built by spring. And I promise it will have everything you need, including bookshelves for all the books a teacher might want." "Are you proposing, Thomas Drake?" Charlotte asked, a smile playing at her lips. Drake's expression grew serious. "If I were, would you accept?" "I might," Charlotte teased. "If it were a proper proposal." To her surprise, Drake released her and dropped to one knee right there on the bridge, taking her hand in his. "Charlotte Wilson," he said solemnly, though his eyes danced with happiness, "would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? I can't promise a perfect life, but I can promise to love you every day of it." Charlotte felt tears spring to her eyes. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will marry you, Thomas Drake." He rose and gathered her in his arms again, sealing their engagement with a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. Hand in hand, they walked back toward town, making plans and sharing dreams. Charlotte knew there would be challenges ahead she would need to explain to Edward, and Drake would need to complete his ranch and settle into a more stationary life than he was accustomed to. But with the certainty of their love as a foundation, those challenges seemed manageable, even welcome. As they approached the Henderson store, Drake stopped and pulled something from his pocket, a small velvet box. "I almost forgot," he said with a sheepish smile. "I got this in Denver." Inside was a delicate gold ring set with a small but perfect diamond. "It's beautiful," Charlotte breathed as he slipped it onto her finger. "Not half as beautiful as you," Drake replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "But it's a start." Margaret and Robert were delighted by their news, confessing that they had hoped all along that Drake would come to his senses and return for Charlotte. "That's why we never pushed you too hard toward Edward Mills," Margaret admitted with a twinkle in her eye. "I had a feeling Thomas wouldn't stay away forever." The months that followed were busy ones. Charlotte continued working at the store while Drake divided his time between Silver Creek and his ranch property, overseeing the construction of their home. They were married in a simple ceremony at the local church just before Christmas, with the Hendersons standing as witnesses and surrogate parents. By late spring of 1879, the ranch house was complete, a sturdy, comfortable home with wide porches and, as promised, ample bookshelves. Charlotte hung curtains and arranged furniture, turning the house into a home while Drake worked with his small crew to build up the cattle herd and establish the ranch as a viable operation. One evening in early summer, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold and crimson, Drake took Charlotte's hand and placed it gently over her still flat stomach. "You think he'll have your eyes or mine?" he asked quietly. Charlotte turned to him in surprise. "How did you know? I was going to tell you tonight." Drake smiled, pulling her close. "You've been glowing for weeks, and Margaret might have hinted that you asked her about remedies for morning sickness." He kissed her forehead. "Are you happy about it?" "More than I can say," Charlotte replied, nestling into his embrace. "Are you?" "Happier than I ever thought possible," Drake admitted. "When I rode into Rawhide that day, I never imagined that paying your brother's debt would lead to all this." He gestured to their home, the land stretching out before them, and finally to Charlotte herself. "It was the best investment I ever made," Charlotte laughed, lifting her face for his kiss. "And to think you paid triple the asking price." "Worth every penny," Drake murmured against her lips. And then some. As darkness fell around them, they remained on the porch, talking softly about their child, their future, and the journey that had brought them together. The road from Rawhide to this moment had been fraught with danger and uncertainty. But as Charlotte rested in the arms of the man she loved, she knew she wouldn't have changed a single step. Their love story had begun with a desperate act of rescue, but it had grown into something far deeper, a partnership built on mutual respect, understanding, and a devotion that would carry them through whatever challenges lay ahead. For Thomas Drake, the wandering cowboy had found his home at last, and for Charlotte Wilson, the woman who had once been treated as property had found her true value in the heart of a man who would cherish her always. On a ranch in Colorado, with the mountains standing sentinel in the distance, they had created not just a home but a sanctuary. And as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, they held each other close, grateful for the twist of fate that had brought them together and the love that would keep them that way for all the days to come.